Welcome back, Night Owls. This is Dr. Nighttime, and tonight it's going to be a bit of a different video. I'm not actually going to talk about any real math here. I just didn't know where else to put this, because I felt like it was important for me to make a video on this and upload it. This is in response to a disturbing image that I received through my Jewish social media feeds of an anti-Israel demonstration at Hunter College in New York City that was definitely misleading and an attempt to make people think that Israel was guilty of crimes that it is not guilty of. Personally, I would classify this as a libel or something like it. I have to put the or something like it modifier on it because I think there may be a loophole where libel doesn't count if it's against a state entity rather than an individual person. Yet still, in this climate, where there are calls for action to be taken against individuals and for financial action to be taken against the state of Israel, it certainly feels like it violates the spirit of the prohibition against libel by omission. Now, for people claiming, well, isn't this just freedom of speech? Freedom of speech has its limitations. There are laws against slander and libel. There are anti-defamation laws. And what a lot of people don't quite know is that you don't actually have to explicitly say the lie that you want people to believe. If you incorrectly present true facts in a manner where the target audience would believe something not true, that can also be classified as defamation. Slander in spoken word, libel in print. Here's a brief excerpt from an article detailing one particular case. And the threshold to show that someone is guilty of this is that a reasonable reader would have to believe the lie, and you have to demonstrate intent to deceive. And in the case from Hunter College, I will make a case that that standard has been met, with the caveat that I'm not sure if they actually can be sued because they didn't talk about any particular person committing a crime. But I would say it would be completely fair for those students to be suspended and for that student group to be disbanded, right? That is a lower threshold than you get a criminal record over this. All right, so what's the problematic document? Problematic document was shared with me as an example of what's so problematic. And I'll go through why it's so problematic. Up at the top and several times throughout the document, they use the word colonization. Now, colonization can mean you have a largely unpopulated area and you start to have people live there and live as a colony there. But when we talk about it in the context of colonialism, what that means is, so there's some country and they move into another country to essentially rule it as if it were part of the mother country. It seems pretty clear that's what the authors of this document mean, as at the bottom they say, we demand our land back, all of it. And so it seems like this document is intended to convince people that Israel's existence is just a case of stolen Arab land and that Palestine has a right to completely dismantle Israel. Assuming that's what this document is trying to say, then it is libelous. And so let's start going through what the problems are. First of all, you have this 1947 demarcation of Palestine. Now here, where they're comparing Palestine and Israel, the implication is, okay, so you have the state of Palestine right here in these dark gray areas here, and the state of Israel in these lighter gray areas here. And the implication here is that there was this state of Palestine that existed all throughout here long before. That is not correct. The boundaries you see here did not exist until 1921. Prior to the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, many present-day countries, including Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, I think, is on that list, Lebanon's on that list, but they weren't individual countries with their own constitutions. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. After the end of World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Allied forces, largely Britain and France, oversaw a transition into not British and French control, but into control based on who actually lived there. And so in 1918, shortly after the end of World War I, the area making up modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, that was all left as just some region. It was labeled Palestine, but had no inherent connection to the state of Palestine that declared independence in 1988. But the big question was, all right, so, and as many of those other countries, right, Iraq, Syria, etc., as they were gaining independence and fully forming their own governments within a couple of years after 1918, there was this larger question of how to resolve the political tensions between Jews and Arabs, and where should Jews have autonomy, where should Arabs have autonomy. In 1921, they took the natural boundary of the Jordan River and pointed out that on that east side of the Jordan River, there was like one city with a significant Jewish population. That's not enough to say that Jews have a right to autonomy in this one city, right? You don't make a whole new country off of that. So they just used that river as a dividing line and said, all right, anything east of that should be an Arab state. Went on to become Transjordan, then named to Jordan. Anything west of that, there's still going to be debate about. Let's look at what this document would have you believe the history was under British oversight. Before 1948, Palestine was under British colonization. Without permission from the native Palestinians, the land was given to the Jewish people through the Zionist movement in order to establish a Jewish settler colony named Israel. Okay, this is one lie after another. First of all, yes, well, it was under British control and oversight. That is not colonization. We don't talk about the British colonization of Jordan from 1918 to 1921. We don't talk about British colonization of Yemen or anywhere else from the former Ottoman Empire. Looking at stuff from post-World War II. We don't talk about the American colonization of Japan. We don't talk about the Soviet, British, French, and American colonization of Germany. No, you talk about occupation and how the goal was these people who live here, let's make sure they have their own autonomy. And great care was taken to make sure that, by and large, wherever there was a Jewish majority, you had Jewish autonomy, and wherever there was an Arab majority, you had Arab autonomy. Taking a look here, you can see where there was privately owned Jewish land, where there was privately owned Arab land, and where there was just public state-owned land, large parts of that, or just either the Judea or Negev desert. And you can see, for the most, if you were to divide the north versus the south, in the north, by and large, the Jewish areas became part of the proposed Jewish state, the Arab areas became part of the proposed Arab state, with Jerusalem and its significant both Jewish and Arab populations that was supposed to be under UN administration, though completely surrounded by Arabs, and there was an issue later on that I'll talk about with that, but that's in the north. In the south, largely unowned land, and yet a lot of that vacant land, or vacant or very low population density land, was slated for the Jewish state. Now, why was that? It all has to do with this body of water down here, the Red Sea. If you wanted to get shipments into here by sea, from Europe or North Africa, you could probably go through the Mediterranean, and as you can see, both Jews and Arabs had ample access to Mediterranean coastline. If you wanted to get stuff in from South Africa or Asia, you're talking about going around the African Horn and through the Red Sea. Now, there weren't really any ports down here. Arabs didn't have a port down here because they didn't really need one. The neighboring countries of Egypt and Jordan already had ports on the Red Sea, and because they had friendly ties with the Arabs there, Arabs could easily get goods, no problem. The concern was, well, what about the Jewish state there? And so it was decided, let's make sure that there's a viable path for goods to get from the Red Sea into the Jewish state. So that's why in the south of the Negev Desert, these largely uninhabited areas were slated for a Jewish state. Now, with that in mind, you can see why the establishment of a Jewish state and the conditions leading up to that cannot be classified as British colonization. The goal was never, let's establish a de facto British entity there. And in fact, the British policies, while they were occupying the region, were artificially slanted in favor of the Arabs, not in favor of the Jews. Best example being the 1939 MacDonald White Paper, which, among other things, limited the number of Jews who could migrate to only about 15,000 per year, and then said anything, so it would be 15,000 per year for 5 years, and after that, Jews could only migrate with the approval of Arabs. And in terms of where Jews could buy land, only 5% of the land was available to sale for Jews. There were no similar restrictions on Arab migration or Arab purchase of land. And so if you're wondering, well, if it was so important that the Jews have this Port of Eilat on the Red Sea, why didn't they put it in before? Because they weren't allowed to. Clearly, this is not the behavior of a country seeking to create a little mini-me in some region. Oh, and by the way, in case you're wondering, that immigration limitation directly prevented Jews trying to escape the Holocaust from moving there, and instead they were killed. And yet people think it's appropriate to portray the British as being too favorable to the Jews. Another problematic claim here, they say, as a result, in 1948, more than 800,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the land through mass murder and forced evacuations. This is called the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. So let's be clear, the Nakba did happen. The number of people who evacuated out was closer to 750,000, not more than 800,000, but I'd let that slide as same general ballpark number. There was not really a whole lot of mass murder. You can look at a couple of situations where, like Deir Yassin, where because the vehicle meant to give the notification that there was about to be a battle, that vehicle crashed, and so instead of people being notified ahead of time, they were suddenly met with armed forces, right? Outside of situations like that, the evacuation was largely conducted through non-lethal means, but more to the point, a bigger problem here is a reader here would say, oh, they gave the land to the Jews and made the Arabs leave. And that the only reason the Arabs had to leave was because it was decided that Jews can live here and Arabs can't. That is complete malarkey. What this document is omitting was the actual motivation for the mass expulsion of Arabs from Israel. Shortly after the partition plan was announced and ratified by the UN, the Arab leadership declared a strike, saying they refused to participate in anything that would give Jews any political autonomy over Jewish majority areas, and in many cases even actively took up arms to attempt massacres of the Jews. Looking back over here, the region immediately surrounding Jerusalem, Arabs in Arab cities on hills were told to arm and just shoot at anyone attempting to bring food to the Jewish areas there. And so, as a result, it was determined to save Jerusalem, to depopulate those cities, make everybody leave, because they were being used to commit a war crime. And then, in May of 1948, when British forces left, the forces of surrounding Arab countries entered in and were actively sheltered and supplied by a lot of Arab villages. So no, it was not the decision to partition that inherently meant that Arabs couldn't live there. It was the decision to try to conquer Israel and prevent Israel from being formed or overthrow it or to destroy Israel shortly after formation. That is what justified and necessitated the removal of these troublemakers. Qualitatively, it was less of a problem than the mass expulsion of ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia after World War II. Except, of course, that when World War II ended, there really wasn't any more reason to expel ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, but they did it anyway. While in contrast here, once the war ended and there were no more hostile forces attempting to invade, there was no more expulsion from the State of Israel. Do note a couple of things here that do constitute legitimate criticism. If they talk about Israel committing apartheid, apartheid means state-sponsored racism. One could very well claim that Israeli policies in Area C of the West Bank could qualify. As they talk about this ongoing theft of land, that's what that's about. That in Area C of the West Bank, these much less populated areas than the urban regions of areas A and B, the Israeli government reserves the right to claim land there for Israeli settlements. This does not seem justifiable under international law. So yes, there are complaints you could make about Israel having colonies in the West Bank in Palestine. That is not the same thing as Israel itself being a colony. Also, I should mention, while a lot of documents like this will try to be deceptive about what Zionism is, this one does not. It's fine. It speaks about Zionism in a somewhat negative light, I guess. But if you went into this with no idea of what Zionism was, other than maybe saying, well, it kind of has something to do with being pro-Israel, then after reading this, you'd still have no idea what Zionism was, other than maybe saying it has something to do with being pro-Israel. The one thing on here that's definitely a lie, they talk about Jewish-only road systems. That is not true. There are road systems in the West Bank that are for Israeli citizens only, but Israeli Arabs have just as much right to travel along those roads as Israeli Jews do. But as you can see, they talk about, we demand our land back, all of it. It's pretty clear that this is an attempt to lie about the conditions under which Israel was formed, making it look like Israel was formed illegitimately, and saying that Israeli citizens deserve to be punished and have their country destroyed. This cannot be allowed to continue. And so if you're in that situation, what can you actually do? If this is happening on a college campus, I would advise trying to form student groups and raise concerns and call for those problematic student groups to be disbanded and call for an organized, centralized effort to make it clear what the truth about the history of Israel is, as well as having students or professors who knowingly attempt to deceive, have them suspended, at least temporarily, from the university. Do note that it would not be appropriate to resort to violence, certainly not lethal violence, as if the main crime here is slander, slander does not bear capital punishment. Now, if you see this happening, not on a college campus, but in some other supervised space, then please do try to get the supervisors of that space to actually enforce anti-slander rules. But what's a harder question to answer is how to react when it's just out in the open and it's just somebody you know. The obvious first step is to attempt to explain what the truth is, and that the narrative presented in this document is inaccurate, should not see the light of day, and is not actually protected under freedom of speech. Hopefully, most people will be more careful when pointed out what you have just said is not true. For a lot of people, the greater truth of rising up against European superiority, blah, 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 means that they don't actually think they have to worry about the specifics of a given case. And there you're left with the dilemma of how far to take things to see to it that truth actually prevails. There is no reason to believe that when dealing with someone like that, a laissez-faire approach to freedom of speech would lead to justice. Ideally, You want to find some non-violent approach that leaves the perpetrators scared of what will happen to them if they continue to engage in these lies. That being said, I don't have any particular threats in mind that would be strong enough and yet non-violent. I'm very open to suggestion on the matter. Until next time, this is Dr. Nighttime wishing you a good night.